let's go to jump in. So Bitcoin is right around 41K. And we've talked before, for the last couple of months, we mentioned that the next window of weakness for Bitcoin would be about mid-January, you know? And it's funny because I mean that's basically when the spot ETF was launched was, mid-January. But the reason for the weakness in my view, it wasn't because of the spot ETF, right? Although I know I concede that that has something to do with it, right? I'm not under the illusion that it had no impact and that it was a huge hyped event that people, FOMO'd into only for them to just get sold on once it actually occurred. And since mid-January, right? Since that time frame, Bitcoin's dropped, about 16% or so, which is a pretty considerable drop for Bitcoin. It hasn't really had that many drops in a while. And actually, we had this chart, the days. I don't know if you guys remember this chart that I did, days since percentage decline. If you look at 10%, we finally had a 10% drop, right? So, while we were up here, when I did a video on this, we were at, like day 140 or something. And I was like, look, guys, we're probably going to have a 10% drop soon because normally we don't go this much longer without getting a 10% drop. Now we have a 10% drop. We could say, all right, how long has it been? Have we had a 15% drop? Have not had a 15% drop as measured from daily closes. Yes, if you measure it from the wick, we've had a 10% or 15% drop, but we're only concerned about daily closes here, or at least I am. So we have had a mid-January correction. You might say, well, what is it about mid-January that sort of brings this on? And it's kind of interesting because if you go back and look at all prior cases of January, February of the halving year, Bitcoin has had weakness, right? It has fallen back into the bull market support band. Last cycle, you can see that we did that, right? We fell back to the bull market support band in Q1 of the halving year. And yes, we went a lot further below it because we had pandemic, recession, and the Fed printed a lot of money. But even the cycle before that, again, you can see there was weakness. Q1 of the halving year with Bitcoin, and it fell back to the bull market support band. Now it held support. And what's interesting is you go back another cycle, and sure enough, right? Sure enough, like every single time, mid-January starts to show some weakness, falls back to the bull market support band. Now, what's interesting is the 100-week SMA, because we've also tested, again, the 100-week SMA around this time frame, either the late part of the pre-halving year or the early phase of the halving year, right? We tested it right here in that cycle just before the halving year arrived. 2 cycles ago, we tested the 100-week SMA in January, February of the halving year, right? And then last cycle, we tested it. And sure, I mean, you can say, well, Ben, I mean, we only tested it because of the pandemic. But guys, I mean, it's happened every cycle. And we even fell below it. We, forget testing it. I mean, we went to the 100-week SMA, and then we proceeded to fall another 45% from there last cycle. Just for your reference, right? Just so you know, if you were not around back then in crypto, right? Like if you were not in crypto, if you want to understand the pain that people felt, a 45% drop below the 100-week SMA. Guess where that would put you today? A 45% drop below the 100-week SMA. That would put you back at the prior low. That's how crazy it was back then, right? We woke up, felt like the wind had been knocked out of us. I mean, I remember waking up that morning, and what was it, like March 13th or something? I remember waking up, like looking at my phone and looking at the price of Bitcoin. I'm like, how the hell is it $4,000? Like this surely has got to be a mistake, right? I thought the app was glitching or something, but it turns out it was correct. And I mean, it goes to show you really can't take anything for granted. And what was interesting about that drop was it basically fulfilled that same thing with the regression rainbow of going back down to a lower regression band, right? Later on. So kind of an interesting tidbit that eventually did play out, even though it certainly seemed like it was never going to. I remember putting out a video. I wish I could take the time to go find it, but it was a video, I think like late 2019, early 2020, and I put out a video saying, hey guys, we might go to the 300-week SMA, and I sort of said it like, the reason for saying it was I was looking at sort of the prior cycles, and saying, all right, well, let me see if I can pull it up here. So let me make this one the 300 week, and we'll make this one the 400 week. So essentially what I said back then in that video, it's not a very complicated concept. It's pretty rudimentary, right? I mean, it was just, all right, guys, first cycle, we held support at the 100 week. Second cycle, we held support at the 200 week. Maybe in the third cycle, we'll hold support at the 300 week. And then sure enough, we did. Sure enough, we ended up testing that 300 week moving average in March of 2020. We held it as support. And so that was why we were looking at that back then. And I don't really know how much I even believed it when I said it, but it was funny that it ended up happening. Today, what I will say is that, first of all, we haven't even dropped to the bull market support band. There's no guarantee that we immediately test it. I will say there's some evidence to suggest that we could, but before we get to that, let's look at lower time frames. Let's look at the 4-hour chart. We've been in this range for a while, right? I mean, Bitcoin's been trying to hold that 4-week moving, or not the 4-week moving average. Bitcoin's trying to hold the 40K level for quite a while. I mean, we first got above it in December 4th. We tested again December 11th. Right here, we came pretty close to testing it again, December 19th, 18th or so. And now we've tested it again on January 19th. And, I mean, if we keep testing it, then eventually we could certainly break through it. If we break, right, if the floodgates are opened and Bitcoin breaks below 40K, then the next level to look at where the bulls would probably try to defend would be the bull market support band. And right now, the 20-week SMA is at 36.3K, 21-week EMA is at 37.3K, more or less 36 to 37K, right? Basically the same values, more or less, that we've been talking about the last several weeks. It's gone up a little bit because it was like 35K, but between 36 to 37K is still that area. And it's quickly approaching 38K, which is an interesting area because 38K is where we were building up to before we finally had a break above, right? So if we were to fall back into that bull market support band between like 36, 37K, if it happens a couple of weeks from now, it could be 38K. That's where the bulls are going to want to try to show up and see if they can hold the line. Are we going to go down there? Well, we could look at the 8 week. So we've talked a little bit about the 8 week for a while. The reason being is that, there have been a lot of times, at least recently, where once we got below the 8 week, we pretty quickly tested the bull market support band within a few weeks, right? You go below the 8 week, you go to the bull market support band. It's happened a lot. It even happened over here, right? You go below the 8, you go to the bull market support band. You go below the 8, you go below to the bull market support band. If you go to 2019, you'll see there's actually a slightly different story. 2019, we did get a weekly close below the 8 week SMA, and then we just got right back above it, and then we came back down and then eventually dropped. So yes, I mean, like we did break below it here. We got another push back up just to sort of draw more people in, and it wicked up, put in a lower high, and then it still bled back down. But what's interesting was once we got below that 8 week SMA and we went to, 9,100 from July 22nd, it took another 2 months just to get back to where that wick was, right? Another 2 months. The markets, I mean, it's really interesting because, when these breakdowns occur, you can be so sure that it's going to happen. And then it just breaks back up, and then it takes another 2 months for it to bleed back down. It's the same concept of the Ether Bitcoin stuff that we've been talking about, right? I mean, I said that if we don't get a weekly close below it in sort of the first half of January or so. Like if the later we get into January, the more likely it is to get a bounce. And that's why I said, look, it's got to be a weekly close below it. If it's not a weekly close, it doesn't count. And if it's not a weekly close below 0.049, then it doesn't matter. It can still bounce. And it did, right? We got a pretty big bounce. But it's the same thing, back over here, right? Like you can be confident that it's going to eventually break down. But if it gets these bounces, you got to just be like, well, you got to respect it and say, yeah, like it kind of sucks. It'll probably go back down and retest it eventually, but it can take a while. I mean, over here, it took, from here to here, that was like, 4 months. And then from here to here, that was another 2 months, right? So you could have been confident that it was going to break, but it still took, from this final test of it, it still took another half a year to break down, So you can look at this here and say, yeah, like, it seems like it probably, at least I think it'll probably eventually break down, given the Fed stays the course long enough to really squash inflation. If they pivot too soon, then maybe we get another wave of inflation. But, you can look at this and say, yeah, like we got close to breaking it durably, and we didn't. We did not get that weekly close below. We got a bounce, and normally when it bounces, it takes at least a couple of months to come back down. So same kind of thing with Bitcoin. Like, even in 2019, it certainly seemed like it was about to, and then we just got another pop back up, and we had to wait another couple of months. So, looking at it, there's certainly a lot of cases to be made that we will test the bull market support band sometime in the next few weeks, right? Are there intermittent rallies between now and then? It's really hard to say. Obviously, the S&P has had a pretty big move recently. But there are definitely times where they don't move together. In fact, over here, Bitcoin was going down while the S&P was going up, So it's not like they always move in tandem. But that's more or less where we stand, I think, right now with Bitcoin. And I guess 40K is still the level that needs to hold for the bull market support band to not come in play. But I will say again, if we go below 40K, the next level to look at, in my opinion, is going to be 36 or 37. Below that, you're looking all the way back down at these prior highs, right? Because a lot of times when Bitcoin breaks out, it does eventually retest it. I don't know why everyone acts like it's a big deal, but a lot of times when it breaks out of a range, at the very least, it retests it, typically. Over here, it finally had this breakout, and then it came back down, potentially sort of retest the bull market support band, right? It broke out, retest, and then it still just collapsed as a recession hit. So a lot of stuff to consider here, guys. Thank you guys for tuning in. I do appreciate it. Again, if you haven't given the video a thumbs up, please do. It certainly helps me out. And make sure you subscribe if you're not subscribed.